The coffee cup was still warm on the counter when I noticed it wasn't mine. My name is Ethan. I'm 34, I build bridges for a living, literally, I'm a structural engineer at a firm downtown, and up until 11 days ago, I would have told you my marriage was solid. Not perfect. Nobody's is. But solid, the way a good foundation is solid, unglamorous, load-bearing, something you stop noticing because it never gives you a reason to look down. That morning, I was running late for a client meeting, moving through the kitchen on autopilot, when I grabbed a mug off the counter and took a sip before my brain caught up with what my mouth already knew. Cream, no sugar. I take mine black. Claire doesn't drink coffee at all, hasn't since Lily was born, said the smell turned her stomach and never came back to it. I stood there for a second, holding a stranger's coffee in my own kitchen, and told myself Mark must have stopped by that morning before work, like he sometimes did, and left his cup behind in a hurry. That would have been the easy explanation. It just wasn't the true one, and if I'd asked one more question right then, standing in that kitchen with the mug still warm in my hand, I might have saved myself the next 11 days. Claire and I had been married 7 years. We met at a mutual friend's barbecue in our mid-20s, and I remember thinking, within the first 10 minutes of talking to her, that she laughed like she meant it, not the polite kind of laugh people give at parties, but the real kind, the kind that made you want to say something else funny just to hear it again. She worked in marketing for a regional outdoor gear brand, coordinating campaigns and photo shoots, the kind of job that let her talk about mountain trails and river puddings all day even though, by her own admission, she hadn't been hiking in over a year. We had a daughter, Lily, 5 years old, all elbows and questions, who had somehow inherited my stubbornness and Claire's exact laugh. We lived in a craftsman-style house on a quiet street in West Asheville, the kind of place with a porch swing we never used and a garden Claire had planted with real intention the first spring we moved in, raised beds, tomato cages, a little handwritten sign that said herbs in her looping cursive. That sign had been leaning sideways for 2 years now. I used to think that was just what happens to gardens once life gets busy. I didn't think about what it meant that she'd stopped mentioning it. I should tell you about Mark, because Mark matters more to this story than almost anyone else in it. Mark and I met in college, in a shared apartment our sophomore year, and something about the friendship just took, the kind of bond that doesn't require maintenance, that survives long gaps in different cities and eventually, when I got the job in Asheville and recruited him to the client relations side of the same firm, survives even working 2 floors apart. He was there the night I proposed to Claire, holding my nervous energy together in the parking lot before I went inside. He was Lily's godfather. He'd been divorced himself, 3 years back, something that never seemed to fully leave him, a kind of loneliness he wore well, self-deprecating, always the first to laugh at his own bad luck with women. He came over for dinner most Thursdays. Claire always said having him around felt like having a brother in the house. I never once thought to question that. That morning, the coffee mug morning, I put it down without asking and drove to my meeting, because that's what I do. I compartmentalize. It's not a strength, though for years I told myself it was. If something doesn't fit into the version of the day I've already built in my head, I set it aside and deal with it later, and later has a way of becoming never. I'd been doing that with Claire for longer than I want to admit, not with anything as concrete as a mystery coffee cup, but with the smaller things. The way she'd stopped finishing sentences about her day. The way, fine, had become her answer to almost everything. I want to be honest with you about something before I go further, because this isn't a story about a perfect man wronged by a cruel woman, and I never want you to think that's what I believe, even now. I worked long hours. I told myself it was for us, the mortgage, Lily's future, the vacation fund we kept talking about and never used, but somewhere in there, work had become the place I went to feel competent, in control, useful, in a way that home increasingly didn't. I'd come back at 7, sometimes 8, and Claire would ask how my day was, and I'd give her 4 sentences and then go quiet over dinner, scrolling through emails I could have answered in the morning. I loved my family. I would have said that without hesitation, any day of that year. But loving something and actually showing up for it aren't always the same verb, and I didn't understand that yet. That Thursday, Mark came over for dinner like always. Lily adored him. He did this thing where he'd pretend to steal her nose and she'd shriek with laughter every single time, 5 years old and still fooled by it, or maybe just still delighted by the ritual of it. Claire made her chicken parmesan, the one dish she always said she made, for company, and the kitchen smelled like garlic and warm bread, and for most of the evening it was exactly the kind of ordinary that makes up a good life, the kind you don't photograph because you assume you'll have 1,000 more just like it. It was near the end of the night, clearing plates, when I saw it. Nothing dramatic. Mark reached past Claire to grab the salt, and his hand landed for half a second longer than it needed to on the small of her back, not a grab, not obvious, just a familiarity that didn't belong to a family friend. And Claire didn't flinch. Didn't step away. She just kept talking to Lily about bath time like nothing had happened, because to her, in that moment, maybe nothing had. I noticed it the way you notice a sound in another room, something registers, something files it away, but you don't get up to check. I told myself I was tired. I told myself 7 years of marriage and a 5-year-old will make anyone touchy and casual with the people they trust. I told myself a lot of things that night, lying in bed next to Claire, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles in the dark. There's a specific kind of quiet that comes with almost knowing something. Maybe you've had that, lying awake next to someone, running through a moment on a loop, trying to talk yourself out of a feeling that refuses to leave just because you've reasoned with it. I didn't say anything to her. Not that night, not the next morning. I went to work, I built my bridges, I answered my emails, and I told myself that whatever I'd seen was smaller than it felt. I didn't know it yet, but the coffee mug and the hand on her back weren't the only 2 things I'd already missed. There was a third thing, from 3 weeks earlier, that I hadn't thought about since, and once I finally remembered it, nothing about that Thursday dinner would look the same again. The third thing I'd forgotten was a text. 3 weeks before the dinner, I'd borrowed Claire's phone to look up a recipe while mine charged in the other room, and a message from Mark had popped up on the lock screen, nothing incriminating on its face, just, "Can't stop thinking about last night LOL," the kind of line that could mean anything. That could be about a football game or a bad joke someone told at a bar. I remember reading it, feeling a small flicker of something, and then setting the phone face down on the counter and going back to the recipe. I didn't ask her about it. Not because I didn't want to know, but because some part of me had already decided that whatever answer she gave, I'd rather not have to sit with it. That's the kind of man I was that spring. I'd gotten good at not asking questions I didn't want answered. Looking back now, that was the first thread. I just didn't pull it. Our days, otherwise, ran the way they'd run for years. I left before 7, sat in standstill traffic on Patton Avenue listening to the same 3 podcasts on rotation, spent my mornings buried in load calculations and client redlines. Claire dropped Lily at kindergarten, then went to the marketing office where she'd spend her day building campaigns for hiking boots and camp stoves for a life she increasingly only lived through other people's photographs. She'd started going to a book club on Tuesdays, new that year, and a girls' night, every other Friday with a work friend named Priya, who I'd met exactly twice and who Claire talked about with more animation than she talked about almost anything else in her life. I didn't think about that discrepancy at the time. I do now. At home, our rhythms had worn smooth grooves into the day, dinner around 6:30, Lily's bath at 7, a show half-watched on the couch before we both drifted to separate ends of the same bed, phones lit up in the dark like 2 people occupying the same room from different time zones. Claire had started keeping her phone face down on the nightstand, screen toward the wood. I noticed it. I told myself everyone does that now. I told myself a lot of things that spring. I remember one Tuesday, supposedly her book club night, when I texted to ask if she wanted me to save her a plate, and it took her almost 40 minutes to write back, "No, don't wait up, running late." 40 minutes is a long time not to glance at your phone during a conversation about a novel with a group of women you supposedly see every week. I noticed the delay. I didn't ask about it. I made Lily grilled cheese and told myself Claire deserved a night to herself, because God knows she gave up enough of them for us. That was the pattern that spring, small inconsistencies that never quite reached the threshold of a real question. A receipt from a coffee shop across town, dated a Tuesday afternoon, tucked in her jacket pocket when I grabbed it to run to the dry cleaner. A new habit of angling her laptop screen slightly away from the kitchen table when she worked from home. None of it was proof of anything. All of it, together, should have told me something. I filed each one separately, the way I filed everything, into a drawer marked later, and later never came. Meanwhile, my sister Rachel had been going through her own quiet unraveling, a separation from her husband Tom that she hadn't told our parents about yet, staying with us 2 nights a week while she figured out her next move. Claire had been the one holding that together, actually, sitting up with Rachel some nights long after I'd gone to bed, listening in a way I don't think I ever fully appreciated. I remember being grateful for it and also, if I'm honest, a little relieved it wasn't my emotional labor to do. That's the kind of husband I was. I let my wife carry things so I wouldn't have to carry them with her. I want to stop here for a second. If you've ever stood in a room full of people you love and still felt like you were watching your own life through glass, you already know what that spring felt like for me, not because anything was visibly wrong, but because I'd built a life so efficient, so smoothly running, that I'd stopped checking whether anyone inside it was actually happy. Rachel, it turned out, would matter more to this story than I understood at the time, because Rachel was the one who, weeks later, would mention something in passing that split my understanding of that spring wide open. But I didn't know that yet. Mark, for his part, seemed the same as always that season, dropping by on Thursdays, sending me articles about bridge failures he thought were funny, asking about Lily's swim lessons like a man genuinely invested in a 5-year-old's backstroke. If anything had changed in him, I didn't see it. Maybe I wasn't looking. Maybe some part of me had decided, a long time ago, that Mark was simply beyond suspicion, the price of a friendship that had never once given me a reason to doubt it. That assumption was the second thread I didn't pull. I wouldn't understand how costly that particular blind trust had been until much later, until a night in early June when Mark said something offhand at dinner that he clearly hadn't meant to say, and the whole shape of that spring rearranged itself in my head within about 4 seconds. But that was still weeks away. For now, life went on the way it always had, ordinary, load-bearing, quietly cracking somewhere underneath a foundation I hadn't thought to inspect in years. The night everything tilted, on the surface, looked like nothing. It was a Friday, one of Claire's girls' nights with Priya, and I had Lily to myself, mac and cheese, a bath that turned into a splashing contest I mostly lost, a bedtime story about a dragon who was afraid of the dark that Lily insisted on twice. Around 9, once she was down, I sat in the living room with a beer and my phone, and out of habit more than suspicion, I opened our shared photo album, the one that automatically pulled in pictures from both our phones, looking for something from Lily's swim class to send to my mother. There was a photo in there I hadn't taken. A restaurant patio, string lights, 2 glasses of red wine, Claire laughing at something off camera, her hand resting on the table an inch from someone else's hand, not touching, just close enough that the space between them looked deliberate. Time-stamped a Tuesday, 6 weeks back. Supposedly a book club night. I sat there a long time looking at that photo. Not because it proved anything, you couldn't see who she was with, the wine glass across from her told me nothing on its own, but because something about her face in it stopped me cold. She looked lit up in a way I hadn't seen directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. Not happy exactly. Alive. The specific kind of alive that comes from being looked at like you matter. I didn't confront her when she came home just after 11, cheeks pink from wine, kissing my forehead on her way to check on Lily like she did every single time she'd been out, without fail, for 7 years. I told myself the photo meant nothing. I told myself I was a suspicious husband inventing a crime out of a candid picture and my own guilty conscience about how little attention I'd been paying her lately. That excuse felt good going down. It always does, right before it stops working. She told me, much later, what that Tuesday had actually been. I didn't know any of it at the time, I'm only telling you now because she eventually told me herself, and it matters for what comes next. I remember sitting across from him that night telling myself this was the last one. I'd told myself that the time before, too, and the time before that, but this time I almost meant it. He said something that made me laugh so hard wine came out my nose, and for 1 second I forgot I was supposed to feel guilty. That's the part one was most afraid of, not getting caught. Forgetting to feel guilty at all. Somewhere between the second glass and the check arriving, Ethan texted asking if Lily's sunscreen had run out, some small ordinary domestic question, and I remember staring at it feeling like two different women were reading the same phone. That's what she told me. I knew none of it yet, sitting alone in my living room with a beer going warm in my hand, trying to convince myself a photograph was nothing. I put my phone away that night and didn't bring it up. I told myself there'd be a better time, a clearer moment, more evidence before I said something I couldn't take back. That instinct, wait, gather more, don't rock anything yet, would cost me almost 3 more weeks of not knowing what I already half knew. The following Thursday, Mark came for dinner again, same as always, and this time I watched him differently. Not accusingly, I want to be honest, I didn't suspect him specifically yet, the photo hadn't shown his face, but I watched the whole room the way you watch a structure you've started to worry about the integrity of. I noticed he brought a bottle of the same Malbec Claire always ordered when we went out, the kind I don't particularly like and never buy. I noticed Claire knew, without asking, exactly how he took his coffee after dinner, a detail so small it would have meant nothing on any other night, and meant everything on this one, because I take my coffee black and she still, after 7 years, sometimes forgets and adds cream. Rachel was staying with us again that week, sleeping in the guest room while she sorted through what to do about Tom, and she was at the table that Thursday too, quieter than usual, pushing chicken parmesan around her plate. At one point, when Claire got up to get Lily a second glass of milk, Rachel looked at me and said, low enough that only I heard it, "Is everything okay with you two?" I asked her what she meant. She just shook her head and said, "Nothing, forget it, I've just had a weird few weeks," and went back to her plate. I let it go. I didn't ask again. That would turn out to be a mistake I'd think about for a long time afterward, because Rachel, it turned out, already knew something. She just wasn't ready yet to be the one who told me. 2 days later, I ran into Priya at the grocery store, the actual Priya, the girls' night Priya, and made idle conversation about book club, some throwaway line about how Claire must be getting through novels faster than anyone I knew lately. Priya's face did something small and confused, just for a half second, before she recovered and said something non-committal about how she'd missed the last 2 meetings herself, work had been brutal. I stood there in the cereal aisle with my cart half full, feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold. Claire hadn't missed book club. Priya had. I didn't say anything to Claire that night either. I want you to understand something about the man I was during those weeks. I wasn't protecting her out of some noble patience. I was protecting myself from a conversation I wasn't ready to survive. If I didn't ask, it wasn't true yet. That's not strength. That's just a slower kind of drowning. That weekend, I found myself doing something I never thought I'd do. I looked through Claire's closet while she took Lily to a birthday party, not for anything specific, just looking, the way you check a foundation once you've heard it creak. In the pocket of a jacket I hadn't seen her wear in a while, I found a hotel key card. No hotel name on it, just a plain white card with a magnetic strip, the kind you'd find in a drawer of a dozen identical hotels across the region. It could have been from a work conference. It could have been nothing. I didn't ask her about it that day. I put it back exactly where I found it, jacket pocket, same fold, and told myself I'd bring it up when I had something more concrete to bring up alongside it. I didn't know it yet, but that key card wasn't the piece of evidence that would finally break things open. It would turn out to be almost a decoy, a real detail from a real trip that meant something entirely different than what I'd assume. The thing that actually cracked everything wide open was still 2 weeks away, and it wouldn't come from anything I found. It would come from something Mark said, at our own kitchen table, without meaning to say it at all. I want to tell you plainly how it actually happened, because it wasn't the way I'd always imagined discovering something like this. No dramatic stakeout, no hacked phone, no confrontation I'd rehearsed in the shower. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday, over spaghetti, because Mark got comfortable enough to forget he was supposed to be careful. It was just the three of us. Rachel had finally gone back to her own apartment that week, tentatively patching things up with Tom, and Lily was at a sleepover at a friend's house, her first one, which Claire had spent all week anxious about in a way that struck me, in hindsight, as oddly displaced. Mark came over like he always did on Thursdays, except this was a Wednesday, which he explained by saying he happened to be in the neighborhood after a client dinner. I remember thinking, faintly, that Mark's clients were downtown, 20 minutes from our neighborhood, but I let it go the way I'd let everything go that spring. We were 3 glasses into a bottle of wine, the same Malbec again, when Mark, laughing about something unrelated, said, "Remember at the lake house, when Lily wouldn't stop asking why the towels smelled like campfire?" He stopped himself mid-sentence. I watched it happen in real time, the exact moment his face understood what his mouth had just done. Claire went very still, her fork halfway to her plate. I hadn't been to any lake house that year. We didn't own one, hadn't rented one, hadn't discussed one. And Mark had just placed himself there, with my wife and my daughter, in a memory I had no part of. "What lake house?" I asked. I remember my voice came out steadier than I felt, which surprised me. Some part of me had been bracing for this question for weeks without admitting it. Mark laughed, too quickly, and said something about a work retreat, a rental his firm used sometimes. Claire and Lily must have tagged along on a weekend I was traveling for a job site inspection. Claire picked up the thread almost seamlessly. Yes, that trip, back in April, she'd mentioned it, hadn't she? She was almost convincing. Almost. Except I remembered April. I remembered exactly what I'd been doing that weekend, because I'd been the one traveling, not them, a site inspection 2 states over, gone Thursday to Sunday. And I remembered, with sudden and total clarity, a photo Claire had texted me that weekend of Lily at what she'd called a friend's pool, sunlight on water, a deck railing behind her I hadn't looked twice at then and could now, in memory, recognize as absolutely not belonging to any friend's house I knew. I didn't say any of that out loud. I said, right, that trip, and passed the bread basket, and finished dinner like a man who believed the story he'd just been told. Something in me had already tensed the moment Mark said, "Lake house," not confirmation exactly, more like watching the last support beam crack under weight I'd been pretending wasn't there. Mark left a little after 9, hugging me at the door the way he always did, and I stood in my own kitchen afterward, doing the dishes automatically, feeling strangely calm in a way I didn't trust. That night, once Claire was asleep, I did something I'd never done before in 7 years of marriage. I went into the garage, dug out an old laptop we kept for tax records, and searched our joint credit card statement from April. There it was. A charge from a lakeside rental company, 2 nights, the same weekend I'd been away. Not hidden particularly well, she probably assumed I'd never have reason to look, the same way I'd assumed, for years, that I'd never have reason to doubt her. I sat with that for a long time in the dark garage, laptop glow the only light, and I didn't cry and I didn't feel the urge to wake her up and scream. I felt something colder and more organized than that, a decision starting to take shape that I wasn't ready to name yet. Over the next several days, without saying anything, I did what I do best. I built a case, methodically, the way I'd build a load calculation, one confirmed fact at a time, nothing assumed, nothing dramatized. I found 3 more charges that didn't add up against the timeline she'd given me over the months. I found a second hotel key card, different property this time, tucked in the same jacket pocket where I'd found the first. She hadn't moved it, hadn't thought to. I found, going back through the shared photo album one more time, a second photo from that same restaurant patio, this one catching, at the very edge of the frame, a hand that was unmistakably Mark's, a signet ring on the 4th finger I'd seen on his hand 1,000 times across 1,000 Thursday dinners. I remember staring at that ring in the photo longer than I probably needed to. That was the moment the shape of it stopped being an abstract fear and became a specific, unbearable fact with a face attached to it, a face I'd trusted longer than I'd trusted almost anyone. I called Rachel. I don't know exactly why except that some instinct told me she already knew something, from that half-finished sentence at the dinner table weeks before. I asked her straight out, not accusing, just asking, if she knew anything about Claire and Mark. There was a long silence on the line before she said, quietly, I wasn't sure if it was my place to say anything. I saw a text on her phone, months ago, when she left it on the counter. I told myself I'd misread it. I should have told you. I'm sorry, Ethan. That's the moment the last of the fog burned off. Not the credit card charges, not the photo, not even Mark's slip of the tongue, my own sister's apology, the guilt in her voice, confirming that this hadn't been a 2-week fear. It had been going on long enough that other people had already seen it and decided, out of some misplaced loyalty or fear of the wreckage, not to tell me. I didn't confront Claire that night, or the next. I spent 4 days gathering everything into something coherent, dates, charges, the 2 key cards, screenshots of the photos, not because I needed more proof for myself, but because some part of me, methodical to the last, wanted to lay it all out where she couldn't reframe it, couldn't minimize it, couldn't tell me a story that almost worked the way the lake house story had almost worked. I didn't know it yet, but when I finally did sit her down with everything spread across our kitchen table, she wouldn't try to talk her way around it the way she had with Mark's slip. She'd do something I hadn't prepared for at all, she'd stop me before I finished, and tell me something that had nothing to do with hotel key cards. I laid it out on the kitchen table on a Sunday night, after Lily was asleep, the way I might lay out a set of blueprints for a client who needed to understand exactly where a structure had failed. The credit card statement. Both key cards, side by side. The photo, printed, Mark's ring circled in pen, a detail I regretted the moment I saw her face land on it. I know about the lake house, I said. I know it wasn't a work retreat. I know about at least 2 hotels. I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I already know. I just want to understand how long. My voice came out flat, controlled, each sentence set down like another piece of evidence, because if I let it be anything else, I was afraid of what would come out instead. Claire looked at the table for a long moment, and I watched her face do something I hadn't expected, not panic, not the scramble for an excuse I'd braced for after the lake house lie. Something closer to relief. Like a held breath finally let go. Stop, she said quietly. Before you say anything else, there's something you need to hear first, and it's not what you think. I remember bracing for a name I didn't know yet, some other betrayal I hadn't uncovered. What she said instead was smaller and somehow worse. It's been going on for almost a year. Not the way you're picturing it started, though. I need you to actually hear how, or none of this will make sense, and I think you deserve to actually understand, even if you hate me after. I didn't say anything. I just sat down across from her and let her talk. It started in March, a year ago, at your firm's spring dinner. You got pulled into that call with the Charlotte client and left me standing alone at that table for almost 40 minutes. Mark sat down next to me because he saw I looked out of place, and we just talked. That's genuinely all it was, that first night. But I remember thinking, driving home, that it was the first real conversation I'd had in months where someone asked me a question and then actually waited for the answer. I told myself the coffee we got 2 weeks later was nothing, 2 old friends catching up while you were buried in the Meridian project. I told myself that the whole spring, every single time, right up until the afternoon he took my hand across a table and I didn't pull it back. That was the first line I actually crossed, and I remember exactly what I told myself in that second, that I'd earned one moment of being looked at like I mattered, and that it would be the only one. It wasn't the only one. It became the lake house, and 2 hotels, and I got frighteningly good at building a version of my week that had room in it for both lives without either of us noticing the seams. The scarier part, Ethan, is how normal it started to feel. I'd hang up with him and walk back in the house and help Lily with her spelling words like nothing had happened, and some nights I actually believed nothing had. I was terrified constantly, not just of you finding out, though God, that terror never left. I was terrified of who I was becoming, and even more terrified of stopping, because stopping meant going back to a house where I'd started to feel like a fixture instead of a person. I couldn't look at Lily's drawings on the fridge some mornings. I'd stand there with my coffee and just look away from them. I tried to end it in April. I actually told him it had to stop. I lasted 11 days. She stopped there, hands flat on the table, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "I'm not telling you this to make it smaller," she said finally. "I'm telling you because you deserve the real shape of it, not a version I edited to make myself easier to forgive." I sat with that a long time before I spoke again. "You said I left you alone at that dinner. You're not wrong. I know I wasn't around the way I should have been, for longer than that one night. But there's a difference between a husband who worked too much and a decision you made 100 separate times over a year. I need you to hear that I understand my part in this, and that it still doesn't make what you did something that happened to us. It's something you chose, over and over, instead of talking to me." She didn't argue with that. She just nodded, eyes wet, and said, "I know." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw anything. I sat there feeling something in my chest finish a slow, quiet collapse, not an explosion, just structural failure, the kind that happens silently before anything visible gives way. "I need you to leave tonight," I said. "Not forever, I don't know what forever looks like yet. But I can't sit at this table with you tonight. I need you gone before I have to figure out how to feel anything else." She left for her sister's around 11, and I sat alone in the kitchen with the papers still spread out in front of me, feeling less like a man whose world had ended and more like someone standing in a building he'd just watched fail an inspection he'd been avoiding for years. I didn't know it yet, but the version of events she'd given me that night, honest as it felt in the moment, still had one piece missing. Mark's fate, and what it would eventually cost him, hadn't happened yet. Neither had the conversation, 3 weeks later, that would tell me the last thing I needed to know before I could actually let any of this go. I moved out of our bedroom that night, into the guest room Rachel had used, and for the first week I mostly just existed, went to work, picked Lily up, told her mommy was staying with Aunt Priya for a while because mommy and daddy needed some time to figure things out. She accepted that the way 5-year-olds accept most things, with a question about whether she could still have pancakes on Saturday. I told her yes. Some things, at least, I could still hold steady. Mark didn't call for 4 days. When he finally did, I let it go to voicemail, then listened to it standing in my driveway, a long, stumbling apology that kept circling back to how much our friendship had meant to him, as if that fact was supposed to soften anything. I didn't call him back. I saw him once more, 3 weeks later, in the hallway outside the client relations offices, and neither of us said a word. He put in for a transfer to the firm's Charlotte office at the end of that month. I heard, secondhand, through a colleague, that it hadn't been entirely voluntary, that once word made its way to a couple of people at the firm, including someone on the partner track who'd never particularly liked him, his position had gotten quietly uncomfortable in a way that made the transfer look better than the alternative. He kept his job. He didn't keep much else. The last I heard, from that same colleague, was that whatever had existed between him and Claire hadn't survived the ordinary light of an actual relationship once the secrecy was gone. It turned out the thing they'd built needed hiding to stay alive. Claire and I went to 2 rounds of counseling, mostly, I think, because I owed it to the 7 years and to Lily to at least find out whether anything honest could be rebuilt from what was left. What I found out, across those sessions, was something quieter and more final than anger, that I didn't trust the floor anymore, and a marriage without trust in the floor isn't a marriage, it's just 2 people standing very carefully. I filed for divorce that October. Claire didn't fight it, and to her credit, she never once tried to make Lily a battleground. We split custody fairly, without lawyers turning it into a war, which I've come to understand is its own kind of rare. She lost more than the marriage, in the end. She lost the respect of people who'd known us both for years and drew their own conclusions once the story got out, the way these things always eventually do in a town the size of ours. She lost Mark, who by all accounts moved on within the year to someone new, leaving her to sit with exactly what she'd traded 7 years of marriage for. And she lost, I think, the version of herself she'd been chasing that whole year, the one who felt looked at, chosen, essential. Chasing that feeling had cost her the one household where she'd actually been all three of those things, just quietly, in a way she'd stopped being able to see. I want to stop here for a second, because I think this is the part worth actually sitting with, not just for me, but for anyone listening who recognizes any piece of themselves in this story. I wasn't blameless. I want to be completely honest about that. I'd built a life so efficient that I'd stopped checking whether the people inside it were happy, and Claire's affair didn't happen in a vacuum, it happened in a marriage I'd been quietly absent from for longer than I wanted to admit. That doesn't make what she did something that happened to me. It makes it something we both, in different ways, let happen, her by choosing him, over and over, instead of choosing to tell me she felt invisible, me by being so buried in providing for a family that I forgot to actually be present in it. It took me almost a year to sleep through the night again without waking up at 3 a.m. running through the timeline like I could still find some earlier moment where I might have stopped it. I don't do that anymore. Somewhere in that year I noticed, without announcing it to anyone, that the weight I'd been carrying simply wasn't there one morning. I hadn't earned it back through some big gesture. I just slowly stopped needing to hold on to it. I met someone the following spring, a woman named Sophie, an architect I worked with on a joint project, who asked me actual questions and then waited, unhurried, for actual answers, the way Mark apparently once had with Claire, except this time it was happening to me, and I finally understood what that kind of attention does to a person who hasn't had it in a while. I'm not going to pretend it fixed everything overnight. But I noticed myself, months in, laughing the real kind of laugh again, the kind I used to hear from Claire at that barbecue, years and years ago, before either of us had learned how to disappear from each other in plain sight. I recognized myself again, somewhere along the way. Quieter than I used to be. More careful with what I build, and who I build it with. Lily still asks, sometimes, why Mommy and I don't live together anymore, and I tell her the truth in small enough pieces for a 6-year-old to hold, that sometimes grown-ups make choices that break things, and that it isn't her job to fix any of it, only to know that both of us love her exactly the same as we always did. She seems to accept that. Kids are better at forgiveness than we give them credit for. Maybe that's its own kind of lesson. If there's one thing I'd want anyone hearing this to actually sit with, it's this: notice the small inconsistencies while they're still small. Not out of suspicion, out of care. A coffee mug that isn't yours, a 40-minute delay before a text back, a garden sign left leaning for 2 years, none of it proves anything on its own. But all of it, together, is usually trying to tell you something long before you're ready to hear it. That's my story. Thank you for staying with me through all of it. It took me a long time to be able to tell it out loud without my voice doing something I couldn't control. If any part of this landed close to home, I'd genuinely love to hear about it in the comments, or your own story if you've got one. See you in the next one. The cruelest irony of this story is that Claire's affair was never really about Mark at all, it was about a version of herself she was terrified had already disappeared. What looked, from the outside, like a straightforward betrayal was actually 2 separate erosions happening on parallel tracks, a husband who mistook providing for presence, and a wife who mistook being desired for being seen. Neither flaw excuses the other, but understanding both is the only way this story makes any real sense. What's easy to miss on a first pass is how ordinary the mechanism of self-deception was on both sides. Ethan didn't ignore red flags because he was careless, he ignored them because acknowledging them would have required admitting he'd been failing at something he'd built his whole identity around, being a good provider, a steady man, someone who had his life handled. Claire didn't choose Mark because he was extraordinary, she chose the feeling he gave her, repeatedly, because it was easier to chase a feeling in secret than to ask her own husband, in daylight, to actually look at her again. The accumulation effect here matters more than any single decision. No single missed sign, the coffee mug, the delayed texts, the garden sign left crooked, would have ended a marriage on its own. It was the compounding of 100 small avoidances, on both sides, that eventually became unrecoverable. By the time Mark's slip at the dinner table happened, the marriage had already been quietly failing for a long time. That moment was simply the point where failure became visible rather than the point where it began. There's also something worth sitting with in how differently the two betrayals resolved. Mark lost his position, his social standing, and eventually the relationship itself. Once secrecy, the very thing that had sustained it, was gone. Claire lost something harder to name, the specific self-respect that comes from being the one who chose honesty, and never quite got the chance to reclaim it, even in the counseling sessions that ultimately confirmed the marriage couldn't be rebuilt. Both of them discovered that what they'd been running from, invisibility, in her case, the discomfort of real intimacy, in his own quieter way, followed them past the affair rather than being solved by it. What stays with me most about this story isn't the affair itself, it's how long both of them knew, on some level, that something was wrong, and how much easier it felt to manage the discomfort quietly than to risk saying it out loud. That's not unique to Ethan or Claire. Most of us do some version of that, noticing the crack, deciding it's smaller than it looks, filing it away for a later that keeps getting pushed back. Maybe the real question this story leaves behind isn't, how could she do that, but something closer to home. What are you currently choosing not to look at, in your own life, because looking at it honestly might cost you more than staying comfortable? The marriages that survive aren't the ones without cracks, they're the ones where somebody, eventually, decides to stop pretending the crack isn't there.